everyone, welcome to today's video. Today we'll be seeking to determine the identity of the beast of Revelation 13. There are so many ideas out there on the mark of the beast and what is represented by the beast that I think it would be well to see what the Bible teaches on this subject. Today we want to begin in Revelation chapter 14, and the hope is to establish point after point until it is clear who or what is being referenced by this beast. And so Revelation 14 reads in verse 9, "And the third angel followed them, saying with a loud voice, If any man worship the beast and his image, and receive his mark in his forehead or in his hand, the same shall drink of the wine of the wrath of God, and he shall be tormented with fire and brimstone." Verse 11 continues, "And they have no rest day nor night, who worship the beast and his image, and whosoever receiveth the mark of his name." Here we read of the judgment pronounced upon those that have received the mark of the beast. They are said to experience the wrath of God in verse 10, which we are told in the very next chapter is a reference to the 7 last plagues. Revelation 15 and verse 1 reads, "Then I saw another sign in heaven, great and marvelous, 7 angels having the 7 last plagues, for in them is filled up the wrath of God." And so those who consent to receive the mark of the beast, the Bible tells us, will experience the judgment of God. This judgment is seen in the 7 last plagues, for in these plagues we are told is filled up the wrath of God, which we saw was the consequence of receiving the mark of the beast. But returning to Revelation chapter 14, something that is extremely significant to take note of is the fact that to receive the mark of the beast, one must worship the beast. Verse 9 says, "If any man worship the beast, the same shall drink of the wine of the wrath of God." And verse 11 says likewise. And so it's very important to understand that the issue at the end of time will be that of worship. And so while the first angel called for the inhabitants of earth to worship the Creator, this third angel warns against the worshipping of the beast. Again, worship is the issue that the final controversy will revolve around. Every soul will be faced with the decision to either worship the beast or the Creator. And just by understanding this simple detail, the process of identifying who or what is the beast has already begun. By this verse alone, we learn that it is a religious entity of some sort, a power that demands worship. And so what is this beast that is referenced in Revelation 14? Well, the chapter before describes it at length. We read in Revelation chapter 13 and verse 1, "And I stood upon the sand of the sea, and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. And the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, and his feet were as the feet of a bear, and his mouth as the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power, his seat, and great authority." Verse 3 tells us that all the world wondered after the beast. And verse 4 says, "And they worshipped the dragon which gave power unto the beast. And they worshipped the beast, saying, Who is like unto the beast, and who is able to make war with him?" And so clearly these verses are symbolic in nature, and cannot be taken literally to reference the worship of an amalgamated animal. But each of these descriptions help us in identifying the entity that is represented by this beast. And so what we would like to do is take it point by point and see if we can identify who this beast represents. The first thing we would look at is the source of this beast's power. In the latter portion of verse 2, we are told that the dragon gave him his power and his seat and great authority. And then in verse 4, we see that this dragon is also worshipped. That raises the question, who or what is represented by this dragon? Well, the previous chapter already told us who the dragon is. Revelation chapter 12 and verse 9 says, "And the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceiveth the whole world. He was cast out into the earth, and his angels were cast out with him." And so the dragon that gives this beast its power and authority is a symbol of Satan. And take note, he is also called the serpent. That will be relevant later on in the video. And so whatever is represented by this beast, thus far we know that it is a religious entity of some sort as it receives worship, and that Satan, pictured as a dragon, is the source of its power. Another point of note is that this beast is a globally recognized entity. In Revelation chapter 13 and verse 3, the entire world is said to give him homage. Verse 3 reads, "And all the world wondered after the beast. And they worshipped the dragon which gave power unto the beast. And they worshipped the beast, saying, Who is like unto the beast? Who is able to make war with him?" And so by this we can see that it possesses a worldwide influence. And so try to remember these details as we continue. It is a religious entity of some sort that is globally recognized, and that secondly, the dragon, a symbol of Satan, gave it its authority. The third thing that we want to understand is what a beast represents in the Bible. In prophetic verses, the Bible uses imagery that is consistent and that usually has been defined or explained previously. In the book of Daniel, beasts were already used in a prophetic context, and there we are told quite plainly what a beast represents. In Daniel chapter 7 and verse 2, we read that Daniel has a vision. In verse 3, we see beasts coming out of the sea, very similar to what we are studying in Revelation 13. The chapter then continues until in verse 17 and in verse 23. We are told what is represented by a beast in this prophetic context. It reads, "These beasts, which are four kings which shall arise out of the earth." And verse 23 says, "The fourth beast shall be the fourth kingdom upon the earth." And so a beast in Bible prophecy represents a king or kingdom. It points to a civil entity. It has civil or political authority. So thus far we have learned that the beast of Revelation 13 receives its power from the dragon, that is Satan, that it is both a religious and civil entity, religious in that it receives or demands worship, and civil in that it is said to be a king or a kingdom, bearing in mind that it is a globally recognized entity. The fourth thing we want to point out is that this beast or kingdom was said to rise up out of the sea. Now what does that mean? What is represented by the sea? Well, again, the Bible must explain itself. It must be its own interpreter. And in the book of Isaiah, the Bible compares the multitude of people and the rushing of nations to the rushing of mighty waters, to the noise of the seas. The sea being used to illustrate nations or a multitude of people. But more than this, in the book of Revelation, we are told explicitly by an angel what water represents in a prophetic context. Revelation chapter 17 reads, "And he saith unto me, The waters which thou sawest, where the horse sitteth, are peoples, multitudes, and nations, and tongues." And so applying this definition to our verse, it would mean that this civil and religious entity arises from a place that is populated with a multitude of people, nations, and tongues, or languages. And so think about that for a moment, because the search is beginning to narrow itself down. It is a religious and political entity. It receives its power and authority from the dragon, and it arises in the midst of peoples, multitudes, nations, and languages or tongues. Okay, so that was the fourth thing. The fifth characteristic of note is that of blasphemy. In Revelation chapter 13 and verse 1, we saw that upon his heads were the names of blasphemy. In verse 5, we are told that this beast or kingdom speaks great things and blasphemies. In verse 6, we read that he opens his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle. And so time and time again, this word blasphemy is repeated. From this, we can conclude that blasphemy is a significant component of whatever is represented by this beast. It is a blasphemous power. And so that raises the question, what is blasphemy? And again, the Bible must be its own interpreter. And it gives us two definitions for the word blasphemy. The first we will look at is found in John chapter 10. It reads, "The Jews answered him, saying, For a good work we stone thee not, but for blasphemy, and because that thou, being a man, makest thyself God." And so this definition is simple enough. When a man makes himself God or equal with God, he commits blasphemy. The second definition is found in Luke chapter 5. It says, "And when he saw their faith," that he is referring to Jesus, "and when he saw their faith, he said unto him, Man, thy sins are forgiven thee. And the scribes and the Pharisees began to reason, saying, Who is this which speaketh blasphemies? Who can forgive sins but God alone?" And so for a man to claim the ability or the power to forgive sin is blasphemy in God's sight, as he is taking upon himself prerogatives that belong to God alone. And so this kingdom represented by a beast, thus far we have learned that it is both a religious and civil entity. We saw that the dragon, a symbol of Satan, was the source of its power, and that it rises up from the sea, meaning it arises from a place populated with peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. And lastly, this global power makes itself a god on earth and claims to have the power to forgive sin. Paul also references this beast in his epistle to the Thessalonians. Termed the man of sin, he describes this power in these words. For that day shall not come, except there come a falling away first. And that man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition, who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he as God sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. And so blasphemy is a significant attribute of this power. And in these verses we are given a clearer description of the religious component of this beast. It sits in the temple of God, showing its ecclesiastic nature. But as the reading continues, we again see that blasphemy is one of its main characteristics. It makes itself a god on earth. The last characteristic we'll make mention of is that this beast is said to make war with the people of God. We read in Revelation chapter 13 and verse 7, "And it was given unto him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. And power was given him over all kindreds and tongues and nations." From this we could see that this beast, while it demands worship, it is at the same time a persecuting power, one that destroys the saints of God. And so is there an entity today that meets all of these criteria? I think that one doesn't have to look very far to see that all of these characteristics are perfectly embodied in the papacy. For those that may not know, the papacy is the name given to the system of ecclesiastical government over which the Pope is the supreme head. He is both the head of the Roman Catholic Church and also of the Vatican State, which is a government unto itself. The papacy then is both a political and a religious power, meeting the criteria of the beast of Revelation 13. We know that it arose in Europe, a geographic location that can most definitely be described as a multitude of peoples, nations, and tongues or languages, and so it fulfills that criteria also. The papacy, by its own encyclicals, declares himself to be God on earth, claiming infallibility and the power to forgive men of their sins, which we have seen is blasphemy. It is also well known that the priests of the Catholic faith claim to be invested with the authority or power to forgive men of their sins. And so again, the papal system also meets this criteria. It speaks blasphemies. And lastly, you'd remember that the beast was said to receive its power from the dragon. Well, on the papal crest, there in the very center is the image of a dragon, a recognition of the source of his power. The word Vatican is a word of Latin origin, and it means divining serpent or dragon, the exact words used to describe Satan in the book of Revelation. And so you would have to ask yourself, can all these facts really be of pure coincidence? Well, to put the matter beyond doubt, the book of Revelation is even more specific. In Revelation chapter 13 and verse 18, it reads, "Here is wisdom. Let him that had understanding count the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. Here we are told to count the number of the beast. We are told that it is the number of a man, and that in counting this number it would amount to 666. Verse 17 sheds even more light and tells us that it is not just the number of a man, but it is the number of his name. And by name we are to understand his title. Now, does the papacy or the Pope of Rome possess such a title? Vicarius Filidae is the insignia or title that the Pope of Rome bears. It is Latin for the Vicar of the Son of God. Now, if we count the number of this name using its own metric system, it is a Roman power, so using the numeric value of the Roman letters in its title, you will find that it does in fact amount to the number 666. And surely for a single entity to meet each and every one of these criteria, can it be coincidence? And so I think in light of these considerations, it is clear that the papacy fits each of the criteria mentioned, and therefore we can conclude that it is in fact the leper-like beast of Revelation 13, the power that serves as the enemy of God's people at the end of time. The Church of Rome has persecuted and killed more Christians than any other power upon the earth. Its history is stained with the blood of the saints, and the era over which it reigned has rightly been termed the Dark Ages. Voices all over Europe consequently arose in protest, identifying the papacy as the antichrist, the beast of Revelation 13, and this sparked the Protestant Reformation. This Reformation shone as a bright light in a time of terrible darkness, and thousands lost their lives for a faith that we now take for granted. Centuries have passed since then, and the lapse of time has caused many to forget the history of the Roman Church. Many are persuaded to believe that the papacy has changed. But the leper-like beast of Revelation 13 cannot change, and while it may remain silent for a time, we are told in the Word of God that its deadly wound will be healed, and that having been accomplished, the world will once again wander after the beast.